Saskatoon City Hospital, 100 years. Wow! We can all be proud of the hospital that bears our city's name and has played a major role in our community's development and quality of life. Dedicated medical professionals and staff, community and provincial leaders, and generous donors all have contributed to a legacy of excellence. All have shown us what it takes to do great things. In looking back over the past century, there are so many stories that could be told and deserve to be told, but we can only tell a few. So here's a look back at a century of care and message of hope as we look ahead. At the turn of the last century, dramatic changes were unfolding in Saskatchewan. For many, it was a new way of life in a new and unknown land. There were hardships, to be sure, but there was also hope.
Saskatoon was a very, I would just describe it like almost like a village, agricultural village that was just about to take off. So we're kind of going through growing pains, or making the transition from a small prairie town to metropolis, as it were, like not on a huge scale, but still we were growing into a big city.
Well, it'll be a pretty exciting time, I think. There were partly because there were so many people arriving here from other parts of the world. You know, they were coming from Eastern Europe, from Asia, from the States, from Eastern Canada. They all came with expectations that they were going to make it rich, or find their farm, or start this perfect industry, whatever it was.
And this kind of led into the development of a neat phenomenon in Saskatoon called the Saskatoon Spirit. And the Saskatoon Spirit was this idea that business owners and leaders in the community would put aside their political differences and they would all work together for the good of the city. They would do what it took to make their city a success.
The big deal was water, right? Because with poor water, you get the annual typhoid epidemic. In fact, City Hospital owes its genesis to typhoid in Saskatoon.
There was a gang of workers here building the CPR bridge, and they had their camp by the river, of course, and they there was a sudden outbreak of typhoid there, and it was found that the problem stemmed from garbage and sewage being dumped upriver from their camp. There was a dump, I think, more or less where the Besborough Hotel is now. And you know, people were using it for what it was designed for, intended for, but these guys downriver were getting really violently sick.
Now, there were a number of private hospitals that were located throughout Saskatoon, and my understanding of how they would operate is you would make an arrangement with the hospital for them to look after you, and in exchange you would pay them. One of them was established by a lady by the name of Nurse Beatrice Sisley. And Nurse Sisley had a private hospital that operated that way. It wasn't very large at all. It was a very, very simple facility. And it was in 1907 that City Council decided that they would actually purchase Nurse Sisley's operations from her and establish a city-run hospital. The city took over administration of it, but they left Nurse Sisley in charge. She was kind of the matron of the hospital, if you will. So it was purchased in 1907, and then construction got underway, and in 1909 we saw the opening of Saskatoon's very first city hospital. Eventually the whole project wound up costing just shy of $50,000 in order to establish this. And it wasn't a very big hospital to begin with. And Nurse Sisley and Some student nurses actually moved into the 3rd floor and occupied it and ran the hospital. And it wasn't too much long after that that the doctors in Saskatoon and area started complaining that the hospital wasn't big enough then for what they needed to do, and they were pushing for expansions to the hospital. So that's quite an accomplishment, where a civic government is stepping up and saying, you know, we'll look after this situation and we'll do what we can. And that in turn attracts people. Where are you going to live? Are you going to go to a small town where maybe they'll get these facilities, or are you going to move to a city where that infrastructure is in place? And again, this period of time, Saskatoon was booming. It was going like crazy, and people were coming in looking for places to stay. The city started to grow and grow and grow. And then to put the capper on it, I mean, there's even a city hospital.
November 11th, 1918, the war to end all wars was finally over. It was a time to celebrate, but very quickly a new enemy appeared, the Spanish flu. The epidemic killed 8 million people worldwide, and tragically, our returning soldiers brought it home. Saskatoon City Hospital would now be on the front lines.
One of the ironies of the Spanish flu is it followed the end of the Great War. The Great War ends in November 1918, and people pour in the streets to celebrate 4 long, terrible years. Well, pouring on the streets to celebrate them exposed them to the Spanish flu epidemic, which was brought home to Canada by soldiers. So the Spanish flu first appeared in Saskatchewan in October, but it was November 1918, the year that and the month that the war ended, was the worst year for the flu in Saskatoon and in the province. And in fact, in that month, as the troops come home, it spreads across the country. So you can follow its tracks as it moves across Western Canada.
In Saskatoon, some of the things that they did was they shut down all the schools, they shut down all the theaters, all the public meeting places, and again tried to quarantine it.
The streets were empty, and in fact one commentator said it was like the city of the dead. It was so quiet.
They canvassed every house in Saskatoon, and there were something like over 800 houses that people in the house had influenza. And so their houses were marked with a blue sign saying, this house has been quarantined, you can't enter into this house.
But people, you know, they needed help, they needed care, so they went to hospitals like City Hospital. They bore the brunt of it, as did other institutions in the province. It was an amazing flu in that it struck those that were in the prime of their life, people in their 20s and 30s. It struck with amazing speed. People were dead within 24 hours, so it was truly remarkable. And the death toll in November 1918 alone was 2,500, which was half the number of people in this province that died of the flu epidemic. The workload was incredible in the sense that you're not only dealing with the kind of flu that's never been seen before because it's so virulent and strikes everybody, but because it strikes so quickly. So the problem is that a lot of the people tending to the sick got sick themselves. And so you have not only nurses, but doctors perishing during the Spanish flu epidemic. So it took quite the toll. And the sad thing about the flu is that it came after the terrible losses of the Great War, and it was kind of an exclamation mark for that period and for those great losses. So you've got the losses of the war, the losses during the Spanish flu, and people from all walks of life, including nurses and doctors at City Hospital. And in fact, it wasn't until July 19th, 1919 that they actually held a peace day to celebrate the end of the war. They had to wait several months because of the Spanish flu to actually celebrate the end of the war here in Saskatoon.
One of the interesting things that came out of it was the Union Hospital Act, which called for cities and rural municipalities to get together and actually form union hospitals where everyone's contributing for a service that everybody can have access to. The other interesting thing during this period of time, when the Spanish flu broke out, the federal government transferred responsibility to the provincial government, who transferred responsibility to the municipal government, and the municipal government turned to its people and said, look, we've got a problem on our hands here, we've got to deal with it. And people responded accordingly, or responded as best they could.
As the 1950s approached, it was a time of great change and prosperity in Saskatoon. It had enough of the Great Depression of the 30s and the Second World War that followed. It was time to look ahead. The baby boomers were about to boom. television was on its way, and this new technology created a first in medical history, right here at Saskatoon City Hospital.
1949, Saskatoon was just coming out from under 20 really tough years. Okay, I mean, start with the Great Depression, which hit Saskatchewan and Saskatoon far harder than anywhere else in the country. At the height of the Depression, 20% of people in Saskatoon were on relief. We got out of the Depression in 1939 only to be dumped straight into a war. And that was 6 years of rationing, of soldiers in and out of Saskatoon. There were 7,000 airmen passed through Saskatoon taking basic training here. By the time the Saskatoon Light Infantry returned home in October of 1945, Saskatoon was a city that was really done with hardship. 1949, Saskatoon got the Canadian Medical Association annual general meeting. And like any professional conference, it's a mixture of administration and education. One of the big draws was that there was a plan to broadcast, to use television to do live broadcasts of 6 operations and 3 clinics. Now, you got to understand, this 1949, there were 1,000 delegates from Canada and around the world coming to this conference. For many of them, it was the very first time they'd ever seen television. There was no TV in Canada in 1949. I mean, there were no TV stations. There were maybe a few hundred TV sets at most. Saskatoon didn't get its first broadcast station until 1954. In the day, traditionally what you do is you have all your students sitting around in a hospital theater looking down at the operation going on far below them. But of course, you can't see very well, you're not very close up, there's all sorts of interruptions, people get in the way and you can't tell what's going on. So if you stick a camera right above the operating table and focus down on it, then you get an uninterrupted, close-up view of exactly what's going on and everybody gets to see. More importantly, it's not just a handful of students in a lecture theater, it's potentially scores or hundreds of students anywhere in your broadcast area. The first official broadcast was in the morning of the first day of the conference, and they showed a coccygectomy, which is a tailbone removal operation. It was very enthusiastically received. The thing about TV, of course, that it's new, right? And the people there were talking about the potential of television as a medical educational tool. The premier was at the first broadcast. A commentator at the time speaking said that television had the potential to be the most effective communications tool in the history of mankind. I think, if we look back on 60 years of TV from where we stand now, we can see that television really did change our world. And in Saskatoon, this was the beginning.
Saskatchewan takes pride in being the birthplace of Medicare, now recognized worldwide. But in 1962, this concept was a source of deep division in our province. But the vision was not to be denied.
Tommy Douglas had a dream of introducing Medicare in this province. When he came to power in '44, he was also health minister. And he took the health portfolio because he believed it was so important to his administration. He had to wait 15 years, though, before he could introduce Medicare until the province was in financial shape. So it's not until 1959, 1960 that he talks about introducing it. He runs an election in 1961 on the issue. He wins a 5th consecutive term, and he interprets that election as a mandate to introduce Medicare. But there's a problem. The doctors don't like it. They don't like it because they believe that Medicare represents government control of the medical profession, and they want nothing to do with it. Despite the doctors' opposition, Douglas goes ahead because this is something he's always wanted to do. So he pushes through with it, but there's a problem. He steps down in November 1961 to become the new leader of the New Democratic Party. So it falls to his successor, Woodrow Lloyd, to bring the legislation forward. Lloyd also believes in the legislation. He's been there since '44, and he's a believer too. So he goes ahead, but he believes in the interim between the passage of the act and the act coming into effect that he could convince doctors to get on side. Guess what? They're not interested. July 1, 1962, the doctors go on strike. They withdraw their services except for emergency care. That emergency care would have been administered through City Hospital, but it's limited. In their place step British doctors. They're flown in, from England and replaced Saskatchewan doctors, they would have provided services out of City Hospital. They would have had to deal with an anxious public that wants service, and yet it's only on an emergency basis. So it's very unsatisfactory for all sides. Woodrow Lloyd, the Premier, is anxious to get this strike settled. In the interim, you've got the creation of Keep Our Doctor Committees, formed by citizens who want to go back to the old system. They do not want Medicare. On the other hand, you've got the creation of community clinics, doctors that support Medicare. They don't want to work in the hospitals because of the withdrawal of services by other doctors opposing it. So they form community clinics outside City Hospital, for example. So the medical system is limping along, and Woodrow Lloyd has to find an answer, and soon, because people are panicking. They're afraid, what's going to happen if there's a serious injury, a serious accident, sickness? This is an event that really tears at the fabric of this province. Lloyd's answer is to ask a member of the British House of Lords, Lord Taylor, who happens to be visiting Saskatoon, to try and mediate the strike. And so he gets the government side together with representatives of the doctors, and they meet in downtown Saskatoon, the Bessborough Hotel. There's a tense, week-long negotiations, and then finally on July 23rd, 1962, they have a deal. So there's the irony. A strike that divided the province, very controversial. Douglas and Lloyd would not back down in the face of fierce opposition. They pass it. There's some compromise. It's slightly revised, but it's in place, and people proudly see it as one of the defining features of this country, and it was invented here in Saskatchewan.
Over 2,000 nurses received their training at City Hospital. In 1969, this era came to an end, and training was moved to Kelsey campus. But the bond of those nurses stayed with their alma mater. The nurses' residence is now the nurses' alumni wing, and the memories of bygone times are still strong.
To tell you the truth, I don't know why I became a nurse. It wasn't something I aspired to all my life. It was something my mother aspired me to be, but it was something I really didn't think I would do. But I was accepted, and I went in and fell in love with nursing right away.
Well, I came in training for City Hospital in 1954. I had graduated from Tisdale High School and came in to take the 3-year program. And I've never been sorry, and I've had a lot of good experiences and made a lot of lifetime friends, especially when you live in a residence for 3 years with all of the other girls that are there. You see the ups and the downs, and you live those with them.
We were young, 17, 18 years old, and you walked in that building, didn't really know anyone, and you were left. And it was strict. It was, you were expected to rise early, you were expected to keep your room clean, you were expected to make your bed every day.
Oh, there were a lot of rules. We had house mothers that lived at the residence, and they kept track of us. And you had to sign in and sign out. There was a board that you pegged out when you left the building, and then you signed in, and the house mothers were right there in the office when you signed in.
Down from there to the right would have been the sleeping rooms for those that were working nights, because it was quieter than being up with the rest of us. And at the other end was the director of nursing. And she actually had a suite on that floor, so she lived in the same building. And then as you went up, the second floor would be for the most junior classes, and then the next year then you all moved up, and so that the most senior classes would be on the top floor. The basement floor had a recreation room, which is where we had our dances, and we would invite the various colleges. And this is where a lot of the girls met their future husbands. At the other end of the building was what we called the demonstration room, which is where we actually practiced giving needles to oranges and making beds and putting on slings and things like that.
Well, as a student, I think initially you're a little intimidated.
In those days, when the doctors came in on the wards to do their rounds in the morning, we were expected to stand when they came in to the nursing station. And we always, the head nurse or the assistant head nurse, always accompanied them on the rounds and took down any of the orders or any of the instructions that the doctor gave. You started out, you would be assigned one patient, and so you were to bath that patient and you were to make that patient's bed. And of course, these wouldn't be really sick people. These would be people who were almost to the point of going home. And you remember back, that was in 58 to 61 when I was in training. So people were in hospital for a long time. So these people wouldn't be that sick, but still would require a lot of care. So that's what we did.
Well, of course, they start you out very, simply when you're a student. You don't start out in an operating theater right away. And there's a lot of training goes into it before you even get into a theater. At first, you're just observing, and then you might, in your third year, if you're doing your surgical part in your third year, you might get to actually assist in some way. Of course, the doctors are there, and the interns, and the registered nurses that are helping out. And to hear that baby cry was that very first time. I mean, I'm a mother myself. I've heard the baby cry 4 times, but that probably was, you asked for a dramatic moment, that would be one of mine.
The 90s saw technology changing literally at the speed of light. A new millennium was coming into view. The time had come for a dramatically new Saskatoon City Hospital.
So in April 1988 was the big sod turning event at the hospital. It was a big occasion, not just for Saskatoon, but for Saskatchewan to have a huge new hospital. When I started at City Hospital Foundation in 1989, and they just dug the hole for the new building, it was really remarkable for me to see how the hospital was built.
Very close. See if I can do this. Oh boy. That's why you're not a surgeon. Close, 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 close. No. There we go.
And we received our check from the Saskatoon City Hospital Foundation for $10 million.
So we had a couple of months there where we could put on tours for the public. We had over 16,000 people come through the hospital on tours, through the whole building. It was amazing. We decided to have the festival trees in the hospital before it opened to the public. Like, once in a lifetime would you ever get an opportunity like that. So the festival was moved up. It was in early November, and we just had record crowds. We had about 60,000 people attend the festival trees at the new City Hospital.
I think it was December 13th, 1993, that we moved into the new building. And of course, everyone who worked at the hospital was involved with the move. And we even had volunteers who were helping. And so, because it all had to be done at once, the patients had to come, the equipment had to come. They had a tunnel that went from the old City Hospital to the new City Hospital, and everything came through that tunnel. Everybody had been moved out of the hospital, everybody had been settled, and we went back, those of us who wanted to go, and we went through the hospital all carrying flashlights and did kind of a snake dance through the hospital, and then it ended up in the auditorium and had a little bit of a program. Yeah, she was a good old building. And it was hard to see her come down, but
So that brings us to today. And the work and innovation at Saskatoon City Hospital continues as strong as ever.
Well, City Hospital is really changing. Now people don't come in and spend a lot of time in the hospital. Minimal access surgery has really changed that years ago. The vision is sort of the Mayo of the North, where people come in, they get diagnosed, they get treated, and everything the same day, and they go home. It's a place for healing, and that's what we do.
So we'll go down to room 12 then. It's mainly used for orthopedics now. This is an anesthesia cart. It has all the medications syringes, intubation tubes, IV bags, everything the anesthetist needs. This is how we used to have our x-rays. They'd be taken in an x-ray department and either shipped over to our hospital if the patient was coming for surgery, or sent up from downstairs. Now we have an online unit which covers the whole province and allows the doctor to draw up x-rays from any hospital or Medi-Center in the province. I've laid out some scopes here and some technology with the camera systems. This is a 3-chip system, is our high definition that we use for gynecology. Just look at my hand and how clear it is. This is our Infinity machine. It's used for preparing the eye in cataract surgery to remove the old lens so the new artificial lens can be replaced. These are microscopes, the Wild microscope and the Zeiss microscope, and they're pretty much doctor preference which one they use. On the microscopes, they're also hooked up to a video monitor which shows the procedure as the doctor does it and allows the nurses to know at what stage the doctor's at and what equipment he'll need next. These are LED lights. They give off less heat during surgery. They give off more light and there's no shadow cast down into the incision. Stuff is very expensive. Like a unit like this is probably anywhere between $50,000 and $80,000 depending on what you put on it. So everything that's got hospital on it is worth a few dollars.
We've been lucky in that at City Hospital we've had great support from the Hospital Foundation, because unfortunately all of these advances in ophthalmology require new equipment, which is invariably expensive. We've been one of their major beneficiaries. They have allowed us to purchase new phacoemulsifiers as the technologies move forward, new operating microscopes, and every bit as importantly, new lasers to assist in the treatment of retinal diseases and glaucoma. So we've been very fortunate to have them on our side, and we're certainly one of their biggest beneficiaries.
Long before the foundation was formed, and the foundation's been around 25 years, people were making donations to the hospital. So for the past 100 years, people, especially in Saskatchewan, are so generous. So it's just heartwarming to see the individuals that have come along and the companies and corporations and service groups that have supported Saskatoon City Hospital. So just a huge, huge thank you to everyone that has helped.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, City Hospital. Happy birthday to you.
Building upon this legacy, it's easy to foresee why Saskatoon City Hospital will indeed be the hospital of the future and of Saskatoon's future. It will be a place that transforms traditional concepts of patient care. It will be the home of advanced medical diagnosis, treatment, research, and teaching. Indeed, the plans for Saskatoon City Hospital already include a fusion of research and clinical care that will be unique in the world. So happy birthday, Saskatoon City Hospital. By looking back at where we came from, we can be confident in where we're going.
When you feel the heartbeat, when you feel the spirit in the air, when you feel tradition and the goal of excellence we share. 100 years of hope and healing, 100 years
Saskatoon City Hospital 100th Anniversary Choir.